We always begin our weekly staff meetings with a question. What are you reading? What is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Just this week, it was what would your act be in a talent show? I'll never tell. Sometimes the question is, what are you watching? Meaning, what are you watching on TV, Netflix, HBO, or FX? The subtext is, of course, what are you binging? Rather than doing chores or paying bills or responding to an email. Recently, someone mentioned they were watching a show called The Bear. I knew it was about food and took place in Chicago. Having lived in Chicago and fancying myself something of a foodie, I thought I would give The Bear a try. Here is the premise. A fancy New York chef named Carmy has returned home to Chicago after his drug-addicted brother, who runs the family sandwich shop, dies by suicide. In an odd twist, the brother leaves the lowbrow shop to Carmy, an award-winning culinary star. But it is the opening scene of the first episode that informs us about the show we are about to watch. On a foggy night, we meet a man in an apron, Carmy, walking alone across a bridge toward a cage. Inside the cage, something is angrily growling. Strangely enough, the man opens the door to the cage, only to confront an enormous and very angry bear. Even stranger, Carmy seems to attempt to soothe the bear by whispering, "I know, I know." But the bear lunges at Carmy. He awakes. It was a dream, one we can only imagine Carmy has had before. The bear is grief. If you have ever experienced grief, you know that it is sometimes asleep. Sometimes it growls. Sometimes it attacks seemingly out of nowhere. It can be suffocating, and it can leave marks that never go away. Everyone in The Bear is grieving something or someone. The characters are all pretty miserable. Some of you have seen it. Yet we are drawn to them. All of us know someone who has suffered profound loss. Just about everyone in this sanctuary has experienced grief of one sort or another. The loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of health, the loss of status, the loss of a dream. It is like having the ground beneath you shake and shake and shake. In rabbinical school, we studied the 5 stages of grief as defined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. While this was an advancement in how we understood grief, few of us who have ever experienced grief would say it works exactly like that. If only it did. But grief is not linear. While we may experience all of these stages, we do not necessarily experience them in a linear way. And just because we experience one stage of grief does not mean we are through with it, or more accurately, that it is through with us. We do not always move from anger to bargaining. Sometimes we come back to anger. Depression may come before bargaining. We might never even bargain. Grief can be incredibly complicated, especially when the loss we are mourning is complicated. The anger may be all we have and too hard to let go of. In her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, her memoir of the year after her husband's death, the author Joan Didion describes her prolonged stay in the stage of denial, imagining a world where her husband might magically appear, and her refusal to part with her husband's shoes, sure he would need them when he came back. More recently, Professor Linda developed another way of looking at grief. She describes the stages as reeling, dealing, feeling, and healing. Reeling is what we experience in the immediate aftermath of a loss. We are reeling, perhaps out of control. Our world has been turned upside down. We experience denial and disbelief. And in our disbelief, we often seem in control. You know, busy making funeral arrangements, making sure everyone has appropriate clothing, ordering multiple copies of the death certificate. At the hospital, Joan Didion overhears a social worker describe her as a pretty cool customer, failing to realize her complete numbness to the reality of her husband's sudden death. The next stage is feeling. In this stage, we feel like we are drowning in a sea of emotions, which seem to turn on a dime. 1 minute, the pain is actually physical. And the next minute, we are angry and lashing out at those who care about us the most. We may feel like our bodies are breaking down, sleeping and eating too much or too little. The third stage, dealing, is the work of death and dying, cleaning out a closet, updating a will. If it is our own mortality a diagnosis has forced us to face, this stage is consumed by planning for a future that may not be long. The final stage of healing is not a single moment, but a matter of time. We don't get over loss. We learn to live with loss. You know, my non-Jewish friends all tell me that Jews have death and mourning right, having the funeral as soon as possible, rather than a viewing with an open casket or a wake in a cold funeral home. They admire how we take the week of Shiva to actively grieve. I agree. Judaism does it right. But I'm not so sure we do it right. To be sure, we have always adapted Jewish customs of mourning to fit our circumstances. The Mishnah relates an episode portraying the unusual behavior of Rabbi Gamliel. He bathed on the first night after his wife died. His students said to him, "Have you not taught us, our teacher, that a mourner is prohibited to bathe?" He answered them, "I'm not like other people. I am delicate. For me, not bathing causes actual physical distress, and even a mourner need not suffer physical distress as part of their mourning." I know some of it is as a result of COVID. Private funerals just for the immediate family, or by invitation only, and Zoom shivas. These, however, are not COVID keepers. I fear we are losing sight of what our tradition has to offer. We seem to have forgotten the daily prayer, Elu Devarim, where we equate accompanying the dead for burial with the study of Torah, comparing the mitzvah of attending a funeral or paying a shiva call with the most sacred of duties, studying Torah. It was once the custom to wear the black kriya ribbon for an entire week or even an entire month. Back when we lived in shtetls like Newark or Brooklyn or the Bronx, our neighbors, whether they were Jewish or not, knew what the black ribbon meant. It meant we were in the first days of mourning, that time when one's grief was still raw and new. And so we were treated with a little bit of extra care. We were offered a seat on the bus. The person ahead of us insisted we go before them in the market, and someone offered to carry our packages for us. Today, how many of us would feel comfortable wearing such a visible sign of mourning in public? Who would go into Trader Joe's wearing their kriya ribbon? Similarly, how many of us could imagine sitting Shiva for a full week? Shiva does, after all, come from the Hebrew word for 7. The practice finds its origins in the final chapter of Genesis, in which Joseph observed a mourning period of 7 days for his father Jacob. While for many 7 may feel too long, is 1 day enough? Is it possible to mourn in just a day? We have truncated Shiva to the point where it may require a new name. There is a well-known book about life in the shtetl called Life is with People. Well, in Judaism, so is death. In Judaism, we are not supposed to mourn alone. We are expected to attend the funeral and to attend the Shiva house. We are to comfort the mourner. And just as important, when we are in mourning, we are to allow ourselves to be comforted. Bell Hooks, the writer and scholar, brilliantly pointed out, rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. Perhaps that is why the mourner's Kaddish can only be said in the presence of a minyan, a quorum of 10 people. It is the recognition that the individual and the community are deeply connected, especially when one is grieving. And yet, many of us are alone. And by our own doing, we attempt to get over our grief. We compartmentalize it. We convince ourselves that going back to work is the best medicine. We trick ourselves into believing that we can all too easily put the past behind us. Too often we are tempted to say we are doing fine, when in fact we are not. Grief does not conveniently fit with our carefully curated social media images. It is as if grief were a character flaw or a sign of weakness, rather than a very normal and appropriate emotion. If any of us have tried these coping strategies, we may have realized that they are not very effective. The truth is, we can run, but we cannot hide. Our grief finds us. This summer, a small group of congregants, each who had lost a parent, met with a grief counselor. Cantor Goldman and I joined them. We realized that there are a lot of you who do not want to do this alone. There are those who do not want to grieve alone, those who want to walk the path of mourning, accompanied by others. So this fall, we will be offering 2 series of workshops, both facilitated by grief counselors. One will be for those who lost a parent, and one for those who have lost a spouse. And in October, on October 26th, we will welcome Rabbi Lisa Grant, author of The Year of Mourning, A Jewish Journey. Director of the rabbinical program at the New York campus of Hebrew Union College, Grant wrote this book out of her own experience after the death of her mother, when she found the need to be with other mourners with whom she could share her grief and explore how Jewish wisdom and practice might support them. We need only to look at our own traditions to learn how to grieve. Tomorrow afternoon, many of us will return to this sanctuary to say Yizkor. In some synagogues, it is the most well-attended service. Often, it is the one service where no one checks to see if you have a ticket. Something compels us to come to Yizkor, even if it is the only service we attend. We think it is because we are honoring our dead. But it is this deep and human desire to be with others, especially when we are grieving. I don't know if he was a particularly observant Jew, but Stephen Sondheim got it right when he wrote, "No one is alone, truly, no one is alone. Sometimes people leave you halfway through the woods. Others may deceive you. You decide what's good. You decide alone, but no one is alone." We don't want to be alone, and we do not have to be alone.